As I mentioned, Rebecca Billings is a Foreign Affairs Officer in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs with the U.S. Department of State. The area INL was created in 1978 and implements programs in over 50 countries. Though initially designed to minimize the impact of international crime and illicit drugs on the United States and its citizens, INL has expanded to become the primary implementer of U.S. foreign assistance in the criminal justice sector. Billings and her team focus on assisting the Afghan government and civil society develop a fair, humane, effective, and sustainable criminal justice system that is accessible to the Afghan people. She has worked for the State Department since July 2003 and has held a variety of positions during that time, including in the political section at the U.S. Embassy in Quito, Ecuador, covering human trafficking issues in Europe and Asia, working in the front office of the Bureau for Overseas Building Operations, and working in the Executive Secretariat, assisting Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice with her overseas travels. Also a very interesting story. Billings graduated with both a BA and an MA in Humanities from Brigham Young University and is originally from Seattle, Washington. The topic for her presentation today, Afghanistan, Lessons from the Largest Criminal Justice Reform Program Ever Attempted. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Rebecca Billings.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, and I'm so happy to see you because I thought the title for this was maybe a little unwieldy. But I would like to talk to you about what we're doing in Afghanistan because I think it's very exciting and hopefully you'll find it interesting, and I will try to leave some time so that you can ask me some questions. So just briefly, again, I'm Rebecca Billings. I am from Washington. I am based in Washington, D.C. I work at the headquarters for the State Department in the Bureau that is International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, which everyone else, including ourselves, we affectionately call drugs and thugs. That's who we deal with. So I am based in Washington. I'm supposed to be some of the brain power in D.C. who helps shape policy and programs for what we're going to do in Afghanistan, and I work with my colleagues who are based at the embassy and at the different PRTs in Afghanistan to implement the programs to help shape what we're doing. So I want to talk to you today about the lessons that I've learned in this program that in fiscal year 12, and I will apologize in advance, I'm sure I will acronym speak. If you don't know what I'm saying, just stick your hand up and say, what is that? So fiscal year 11, so FY11, our programs alone were $100 million. Just to contrast that, when I was covering criminal justice reform programs in Macedonia, FY06 was $1.2 million. So this is just, our tiny portion is $100 million. And before anybody freaks out about how much money that is, it's still less than 1% of the federal budget. Here's my first lesson. Never get involved in a land war in Asia. Especially Afghanistan. Yes, only slightly less known as never go against a Sicilian when death is on the line. The Italians at their PRT in Afghanistan brought their own pizza oven with them. So, you know, these guys have got it figured out. If you do get involved in a land war in Asia and you're part of the team who has to put it back together, here's some of the struggles that you're going to have in putting this back together. First of all, there are a lot of different ethnicities that live in Afghanistan. Pashtuns are generally the largest, and they're the ethnicity generally associated with the Taliban movement. All the others live throughout the country. Pashtuns actually live throughout the country in small little pockets because as previous rulers had problems with other ethnicities, they'd move Pashtuns into the middle of it to try to keep everybody calm. But these guys all speak different languages. They all have slightly different, things that they find important. The Hazaras kind of look more like this guy. They're left over from the Mongol movement as Khan came out of Mongolia. So they look a little more Eastern Asian, and they're also Shia instead of Sunni, which the whole rest of the country is Sunni. The other problem you're going to have is that about 43% of the population are farmers, and they work on the land. And of the population, 58% of them have never been to school at all. That's a problem that we're having, is that most of the population is illiterate, particularly the women, because women couldn't go to the school during the Taliban reign. And so even though a lot of people have cell phones now, we find that women can't text because they can't read. They can't even read the numbers on the phone because they can't read. So that's been a problem, at least as far as what I'm doing, because How do you teach people their legal rights orally? It's difficult. The amount of people who have university degrees in the country is 5%. I'm not sure exactly how that would stack up against, like Norway or Japan, but I'm guessing it is significantly lower. This is very telling to me. The number of Afghan citizens who would leave Afghanistan if they were given the opportunity is about 38%. When almost half of your population wants to leave, that's not good. And it really shows that people don't really have an investment in trying to fix things because they're just trying to figure out how to get out. Some other issues you're going to deal with if you get involved in a land war in Asia, it's tricky terrain. It looks a lot like Salt Lake City. It's a big ring of mountains in a valley. Even the inversion there, it smells crazy on inversion days because they're burning tires, they're burning all kinds of stuff to keep warm. It is interesting. There are a lot of interesting countries around them, notably Iran and Pakistan. And when the border was drawn between what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, it went right down the Pashtuns. So the Afghans don't really exactly recognize the border, and there are Pashtun families that live on both sides of the border, and they completely ignore the border, so that's an issue. Unlike Iraq, there's not a history of a strong central government in Afghanistan. There isn't one guy or woman who could stand and say, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. It's a lot more negotiation. If you notice that Karzai's been very good about keeping the balance of his parliament very ethnically balanced to look like this. So even though he's Pashtun and even though he's from the minority Pashtun family, there's the Gilzais and the Karzais, and he's politically playing an interesting game. This is a problem we're having in my office, is there's a low knowledge of the legal rights that are actually on the Constitution and that are actually part of Sharia and that are more part of this tradition, especially with the Pashtuns and the Pashtunwali, that a lot of people don't know that it's unconstitutional and against Sharia to sell a woman to pay a debt. And so there's been a lot of mullahs saying, well, this is Sharia, this is what the Prophet said, and other Muslims saying, no, it's not. So that's created some tension. Also, how do you deal with a country who's come out of 30 years of civil war, and before that they were dealing with the Soviets? There's a whole generation that grew up only knowing war, fleeing to Pakistan, fleeing to Iran. There's a lot of problems. So here's Afghanistan. Just, in case you don't know, here's the capital in Kabul. This is where the Pashtuns generally live. This is Pakistan, here's Iran, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, China over here. The head of Al-Qaeda is here in Quetta, so there's a lot of Al-Qaeda, Taliban kind of stuff going down here in the south, which I'm sure you know about. Another problem that Afghans would say that they have is ISI of Pakistan meddling in their internal politics. I'll let you make up your mind about that. I don't know what ISI stands for. It's basically the Pakistani intelligence service. So it's like saying that, the CIA is meddling in everything. So, sometimes they might be right, sometimes not. But it definitely is a concern that most Afghans will mention. So here's lesson 2. When you go about to figure out what is going on with the criminal justice system, have some goals. Here are the goals of INL's justice program in Afghanistan. So we want to develop the central government and the provincial government to be able to, deal with the justice sector in their terms, their way, their government, their constitution. We want to promote the ability of regular Afghan citizens to find justice, to resolve the problems that they're having, to feel like they're getting a fair shake. We want to improve legal education. Right now, education in the country, I'll say prior to to 9/11 was rote memorization. A teacher was very much respected. To ask a teacher a question was to question their authority. So you just memorized things, and it wasn't the Socratic Method at all, especially of how our law schools work here in the West. We want to tackle some major crimes. Afghanistan is the world's largest producer of heroin. 90% of the world's poppy comes from Afghanistan. This is a concern for the U.S. government because government feels this creates instability. We would like to, it's also a policy priority specifically of Secretary Clinton. It'll be interesting to see what Secretary Kerry does, but this is a huge policy priority for her is to protect women and girls because they have no protection basically in traditional Afghan culture. Traditionally, you know, there are always exceptions to these rules. We want to help those who are in the criminal justice system be able to do their jobs. Defense attorneys, prosecutors, judges, cops, anyone in that chain, we want to be able to help them, teach them how to do their job. And we want to be able to figure out how we can go from a donor country to getting the Afghans to be able to do this themselves. So those are our goals. Let's see, how much time do we have? So we get money from Congress. We create programs and we try to look at the whole criminal justice system. And what we did when we went into Afghanistan with our other partners, USAID and the military and other countries who were donor partners, is try to figure out what happened in other countries before. Should we do that again, or are there any lessons to be learned? Apparently in East Timor, Timor-Leste, they just threw the baby out with the bathwater and said, we're gonna start from scratch. This did not go well. So it turns out that there was a criminal code on the books that was pretty sophisticated, and there were some pieces that were working really well. So we were just trying to figure out, where do the Afghans want help and where can we pay for that with our policy priorities? So, and another thing that we wanna look at is, how do the police interact with the prosecutors? We know how it works in our common law system because we all watch Law and Order, right? But it's different there, and do they know how it works? Because they have more of a civil system like the French or Spanish system, so the prosecutor actually investigates the crime. So what does that mean for the beat cop who found the murder? I don't know. So, you know, trying to figure out how we can link not only cops and lawyers, but Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Justice. How do those guys work together? How does a case get handed from one institution to the other? And a strong focus for us has been trying to get Afghans trained to do their jobs so that we can turn this all over and have it be Afghan-led. We don't want to see Westerners of any of our contractors there doing this long-term. And that's another thing, is we don't want to just hand this over to a huge contractor and say, go fix this. We do use contractors, but we also use law schools, and we use NGOs, and we use a whole variety of things that we think will really get in there and get the job done. And this is all done based on the U.S. government's rule of law strategy. So we actually have rule of law meetings every month that is coordinated by the State Department. But the military comes, USAID comes, NGOs come, well, you know, not NGOs, it's the US government. We sit down and try to think, what are you guys doing? What are we doing? How can we complement each other? And then we also go off the Afghans, their government's national plans. So that's cool. Okay, lesson 3 that I learned, stay in your lane. Don't go driving in somebody else's lane. What am I talking about here? Well, this is how the justice sector looks in Afghanistan. So everything above this line is the formal system. How do you resolve something that's a criminal case? How do you resolve something that's a civil case in a formal way? This stuff, informal, you know, would be like dispute resolution or something that you could get involved with in the United States without going to court. Well, our funding authorities, the Congress gave us the legal right to work only in the formal criminal sector. We can't go figure out land use laws. We can't deal with inheritance rights, which are huge issues in Afghanistan. We are strictly limited to formal criminal system, and we really can't play around much here in the informal system too much at all, but this is where a lot of stuff gets done in Afghanistan. There are shuras and jirgas on the village level where if somebody commits a crime against me, I go gather people who I think will be fair in hearing my program. I'll say, Corey and Whitney and Rita, could you come and hear this case, and then something will be decided at the village level. And generally that works pretty well, unless you've got, you know, family bias or corruption or any of those other things. But this is where a lot of stuff gets done in Afghanistan. So it's been interesting to work in this sector that's taken a little while to get it up and going. Lesson 4, find good partners, especially law enforcement dudes. So, right, I'm a program officer. I sit in Washington. I've never been a beat cop before. I've never been a prosecutor before. I've certainly never been a judge before. So we find all those people and we send them over there to be like, you know how to be a beat cop. You know, more specifically from us, you know how to be a prosecutor. let's go teach lessons learned from how to be a prosecutor to our partners there. Additionally, the State Department has the lead on all foreign policy stuff that happens for the United States government. So anything that's decided foreign policy-wise is decided with the State Department. It's also our money. But the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, and DEA all know how to do awesome things. They don't get the money from Congress, we do. So we will give them money and say, hey, Department of Justice, will you take an AUSA, United States Assistant Attorney, send them to Afghanistan, have them work at the narcotics court, and teach them how to put together a narcotics case. Same with the military. The military's been really interesting to work with in Afghanistan. It's very strange, at least to my mind, to have people, officers and enlisted men and women who are in an active combat zone sharing the same space as diplomats. It's been interesting. So, lesson 5, don't create a dictatorship, especially with taxpayer money. So what do I mean by this? Basically what we're trying to do in Afghanistan is, yes, we absolutely want to build up the government's ability to deal with crime and to deal with prosecuting things and to take care of people's concerns. But we don't solely want to fund the government. We need to, this is kind of an interesting explanation of rule of law. We want to follow the rule of law. So it's the agreed upon laws and enforcement of those laws by the government that provides citizens with security, consistency of expectation, and protection by and from the government. So we don't want to create this massive government who's just basically stomping on people. We want to develop civil society and have there be a pushback of where that balance comes. And this is something we're very used to as US citizens, I would imagine. You know, something happens, the government issues some kind of law or edict, civil society, and you as a citizen have a right to say, what? That's dumb, I don't want to do that. Let's talk about this. And there's pushback. You're not, your cousin isn't arrested and, sent to who knows where, and, your family isn't attacked. This is not the case right now. And so we're trying to balance that all with stuff that's in their constitution. Okay, lesson number 6. Before you swoop into a country, know what you're doing. Know the lay of the land. In Afghanistan, there's a hierarchy of laws. At the very tippy top of the laws is Sharia law. And not only Sharia law, but Hanafi jurisprudence. There is a statute that says no law shall be contradictory to Hanafi jurisprudence. I believe this is the same jurisprudence that rules Egypt. It's because I know a lot of countries try to follow the Egyptian model. There is also a constitution that was newly drafted. There was one last drafted in 1969. There was one that was drafted recently. It was written by Afghans for Afghans. There were consultants, but ultimately it was the Afghans who decided what they wanted their constitution to say. There are national laws that should govern how things work nationally. There are regulations like there are anywhere. And then there's standard operating procedure at the very bottom. Unfortunately, seems to be, at least recently, this has been the governing force of, well, that's how we've always done it. Okay, but it's coming to contradiction with all of this stuff up here. So it's been an interesting process to try to sort out what is Sharia and what is in the Constitution. The other really interesting thing, well, there are two interesting things about Afghanistan, is Sharia law is the law. There's no civil court and no religious court. It's all Sharia law. But there hasn't been anyone set in place who's going to decide what is Sharia and what isn't. There isn't anyone who can interpret the Constitution. They haven't had their Marbury versus Madison moment yet for anyone to say, what is happening here? No one has been given the power to do that. So far, it's just been some law clerks who are like, oh yeah, we should clarify what this is, so I'll just write a paper. Nope, that's not how it gets done. So this has been interesting. Also, the other thing about Afghan law is every single trial, if it is appealed at the appellate level, becomes a de novo trial. So any JD students in here will know that means you don't just appeal the case based on, well, I think the witness was tampered with, or I think that piece of evidence was problematic, or what was going on with the jury. It's an entirely new case all over again. It starts all over again. So any progress you made in the first trial, too bad. But also that means, any detriment that went to you in the first trial could be to your benefit. So it's interesting the way that things work in Afghanistan is sometimes somebody will go to a shura and they will not be happy with the outcome, where, you know, the village elders say, you have to give 4 goats. And the guy will be like, what? And so they'll go to the formal system and use that as an appellate court kind of mechanism. And then they'll appeal that. And they can keep appealing it all the way up to the highest court in the land. So it's really very different than kind of the court system that we're used to, especially here with our common law system in the United States. Lesson 7. This is maybe the most important one. Know what your funders think they are buying. So here are the policy priorities in Afghanistan as set for us by Congress. So what is it that Congress thinks that they are giving us money to do? Well, here's the thing. Here is all crime that happens in Afghanistan in any country. If I were to ask you, what has your run-in with the law been? Mine would be, what, speeding ticket? Okay. And maybe I had a problem with a lease agreement with my landlord. That certainly doesn't fall into counter-narcotics, corruption, or national security. The same is true with most Afghans. They're not dealing with counter-narcotics, corruption, and national security. They're dealing with theft. They're dealing with land inheritance rights. Their land use rights is a huge problem in Afghanistan. But Congress wants us to deal with counter-narcotics, understandably so. It's a huge funding mechanism for the insurgency, and it's killing our soldiers overseas. So yes, can totally understand why they want to deal with that. They want to deal with corruption. It's a massive problem in a lot of countries, especially in Afghanistan. Who isn't on the take is a better question than who is. Better to ask, how much of a bribe did you have to pay than did you have to pay a bribe to see a doctor, to get your child into school, to deal with anything in the formal system? Did you bribe the judge? Did you bribe the prosecutor? Who did you bribe to get this to happen? This is a problem for Congress. The biggest problem they want to deal with is national security, because as we saw, Afghan national security directly impacted United States national security. So it's been an interesting thing to try to figure out, where can we make Congress happy and still deal with putting the entire system together so that it works. Because if you want to start a business and you want to work with Afghanistan, is your contract going to stand up? Let's hope, right? Right now, maybe not so much. Okay, lesson 8. Be passionate, innovative, and think of cool stuff to do. So this is what we're trying to do, in Afghanistan. And these are the different sectors that we're trying to work in. And I mentioned that we try to do government supply of justice and the demand side of justice. We've kind of broken it down into these categories. So we want to work with the justice sector development. We want to, like I mentioned before, deal with practitioner support, legal education, major crimes, gender justice, civil society, informal justice, and access to justice. So what I would like to do now is tell you the stuff that you won't hear on the news, because what do you hear on the news? Green-on-blue violence. Someone else was killed. Rocket attack. These things all happen. Every time I've been to the embassy, the duck and cover alarm has gone off. You put on your flak, you hide somewhere. People with big guns go running by. That does happen. But other stuff is happening too. So I want to tell you a little bit about what you are paying for as a U.S. taxpayer and what it's getting us on the ground. Okay, so justice sector development. This is the largest justice assistance program in Afghanistan, and we think probably the world. So they have 108 Afghan legal experts. Only 46 Americans or internationals who deal with this now. That number has decreased over the years. And then 100 Afghan support staff. So what these guys do is they're the ones who are the contractors. These are the prosecutors from Maine who go to Afghanistan and work with prosecutors from Kandahar and say, what are the difficulties you find of trying a case in Kandahar? And the Kandahari guy will say, well, it's really hard to know when the trial even is. And they'll be like, great, what can we do to fix that? Or do you know how to argue a case orally? Let's have a class about that. So what we're doing is trying to go through systematically and find everyone who works in the justice system to say, do you know how to do your job? Because if you just went to school and memorized the prophet was born in the year whatever, you know, that's not really super helpful in like, I got to defend this guy against a murder charge, right? It would be like someone coming to me and be like, could you please defend this gentleman against a murder charge? We'd all be up a creek without a paddle. So right now we're able to get into 24 of the 34 provinces. And that's because of our military partners. In those dangerous provinces, especially in the south, the military has been super excited about supporting the diplomats in going this training. It will be very interesting to see what happens after 2014 when the military leaves. Our programs will still go forward, but we're not going to have that support from the military. So we're trying to figure out what we're going to do when this happens. Additionally, we have advisors who are embedded in different ministries. So the Attorney General's Office, the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of Women's Affairs to help them try to think more globally. Like, if you're going to have a Ministry of Justice, what should be housed there? Should that really be where the defense attorneys are? Probably not. Just helping the different ministry officials learn how to run a ministry. Another goal that we have in the area that we work on is improving access to justice for women. So something that was developed was violence against women's units. So these are specific units embedded in the police who know what to do when they find a woman who's run away from home, which is what they call all crimes in Afghanistan when a woman is found by herself. It's not technically against the law, but women are prosecuted for this all the time. And we found that the police are super happy to have someone who knows how to deal with this instead of be like, oh no, I have this woman on her own, what do I do now? These women are supposed to, these units are supposed to be able to figure out what's happening to this woman. Is she being abused? Has she really run away? Does she have a family who can support her? What can we do to help her try her case? They also have units at the Attorney General's Office who can help on the higher central government area figure out what to do with these cases. Legal aid offices. So if a woman comes in and says, so my father's making me marry someone I'm not really interested in marrying, what legally can I do about it? Or I'm married to this man, it was a forced marriage, do I need to stay in it? So what can I do about my children? Or just anything having to do particularly with women's issues in Afghanistan. Women's shelters is also something that we fund heavily in Afghanistan. It's a new concept for Afghanistan. Does anyone remember Bibi Aisha? We got involved directly with this case. She was in a shelter that INL funded. She's now in the United States. I'm not exactly sure where her case is pending, but this was interesting because the cops didn't want to go in and grab. Does everyone know this story? I can't remember what the impetus was. I don't know if she was being forced to marry someone she wasn't happy about. Does anyone remember what started this off? In any case, she did something that displeased her father and her brother, and so they pinned her down and they cut off her nose. Her brother and her father, mind you, cut off her nose and cut off her ears. And so the police didn't want to go in to get the brother and the father because it was a really dangerous kind of tribal area. So the cops were really smart. They waited for those guys to come to the market, and they arrested them. Yay! Of course, there was corruption involved, and the case was, I think they got like a 6-month sentence or something. But that was really exciting for us. It was like, hey, we're moving this forward, we're going somewhere. So that has been an interesting case to follow that got a lot of international press. This is my coworker and this is one of our NGO implementers opening a new shelter. You can see there are like a jillion women behind. This is very interesting to Afghans. And as part of these shelters, there's a law that was put into the books called the Law Against the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And it's been very interesting to talk to Afghans about this law. Some are like, well, it doesn't go very far, but it's better than nothing. Especially the students I talk to, the male students I talk to are like, no, more needs to be done to protect women. Well, the shelters can help with that because if a woman is being abused, then she can go to a shelter and hopefully get legal help there as well as physical and emotional help. It is a new concept in Afghanistan. It is highly controversial. One of the ministers, I don't want to name names, but one of the ministers frequently will say, they are Western brothels, we're Western men, house our women, and nothing could be further from the truth. Western US men don't even know where they are. Only our female implementers do. So that's a problem when the minister stands up and says, these are brothels, let's burn them down. So it's an interesting relationship between the NGO and the central government, the Ministry of Women's Affairs. It's been interesting to watch the NGOs come together and try to sort out how they're going to deal with the central government. And they've done a really good job without any kind of real assistance from, the United States government or any of the other governments. So just so you can tell what's going on here, well, just so you know, we fund 6 of the 14 shelters that are in Afghanistan right now, and it's a huge policy priority for us to keep funding those. This woman here came to the shelter because her husband was beating her with a shovel and irreparably broke her arm in so many places that it won't heal right. I mean, medical care is not that great there, but she lost the use of her arm. And I can't remember this woman's story, but I'm sure it was something equally tragic. What else are we doing? Oh, let's skip that one. Defense attorneys. When the international community came into Afghanistan in 2005 and really started working, there were 19 defense attorneys in the country. There was a history of defense attorneys in the country, but it was kind of weak and not really centrally located. Because of what we've been doing in Afghanistan, there's an advocate's law, which is directly based on Sharia. Muhammad, in the Quran, it says, anyway, that's a really popular concept in Islam, is you need an advocate. So that works great. There's now an independent bar association with more than 1,400 members now in just this many years. There's a legal aid department at the Ministry of Justice, and we have a defense organizations. We fund 25 of them. So you should be able to find an advocate for you. These are the coolest things ever. I'm so excited about these legal education programs. So Stanford University got really excited about the kind of what was going on as far as law enforcement or legal education in Afghanistan. And they got together and said, we should write some textbooks. We don't think there are any legal textbook based on Afghan law and based on Afghan constitution. So the Stanford law students wrote textbooks. They have been drafted, they are published, they are now in their second revision. What we just started this year, and I actually awarded this grant, I was very happy this day, is we started an LLB program at the American University of Afghanistan. Since law is an undergraduate degree in Afghanistan, students who started school this fall will graduate with a law degree in 4 years at this great school. So these are classes that I actually attended. This was a commercial law, and this was like an advocate's law. You will see that there are some women in these classes, which is really exciting, and that we fund a female teacher here who was excellent. And my colleague who was with me, who has a JD, said that the way that they were teaching the classes was on par with the way classes would be taught in the United States. They're really good classes. Another program that we fund is with the University of Washington Law School. And so what they do is they find promising professors at law schools, both the Sharia faculty and the law and politics faculty, which is a story for another day. This guy is a graduate, and this guy is a graduate. They teach at the University of Balkh up in the north. They find these promising professors, teach them English, bring them to Seattle to see how they do academically. If they do well enough, they actually enroll them in the University of Washington Law School, and they get LLM degrees. In order to have a law program that is recognized internationally, you need to have people who have PhDs. You can't get a PhD till you have an LLM. We would prefer, as the US government, that we have people who have PhDs that are not just from Iran and from Saudi Arabia. So this is the first attempt to try to get professors who have degrees from outside Saudi and Iran, who speak English, who can communicate with the international community in English. And it's been very popular. And when we went and visited these guys up in Balkh, I asked, so has anything changed since you came back? Do you teach differently? And they're like, oh, it's utterly revolutionized how we teach our courses. We use the Socratic Method. We challenge the students. I want homework from them. I want them to come asking good questions. I don't want them to think instead of just memorizing. So these are just two guys at this university up in the north, and it's really starting to change the education system in Afghanistan, which is very exciting. So this is what I do. This is my portfolio. Legal aid organization, and because of time, I'll just kind of go through this quickly. So we can see this guy's on trial, and we are trying to get people to have representation while they're at trial. This is a course of a fairly conservative university at Kabul University, it's the Sharia Law Faculty, but you notice these are all women, and they're actually taking courses offered by one of the NGOs that I accidentally hit something. Sorry, that trains them how to be an attorney. The day that we went to this class, they were learning how to identify witnesses and how to question witnesses. And they asked me, please, to not photograph their faces because it's very conservative. So that's why the picture's from the back, but this says in Dari, Sharia Law Faculty. But many of these students who were probably about your age, a lot of you, turned around and said in perfect English to me, "Hello, welcome to our class. It's so nice to have you. Thank you very much for the money that you've given us." That's awesome. That never happens. So these are bright, bright students, and I think the future of Afghanistan is in these students' hands, personally. Okay, the last thing that we do that I think is super cool is policy-wise, like I mentioned, counter-narcotics, huge deal. Congress, all over this. The international community, all over this, except maybe the Russians. So what we have is, when the law was said, it was like anyone who is caught in possession of hashish, precursor chemicals, or heroin will be processed at this super spiffy justice center where the best attorneys are and the best judges are. Well, the limits were set by the Afghans, which is kind of funny, and the international community was like, it seems like a reasonable amount. I can't remember the amounts, but it's like 50 kilos of hashish, which we were like, that's massive. Okay, in Afghanistan, that's just walking around cash. Like, everybody has 50 kilos of marijuana. Everybody has some amount of something, because that's the cash crop in Afghanistan. And then when a warlord comes in and says, you can have this land if you if you grow this poppy for me, it's a huge problem. So anyway, there is a counter-narcotics justice center, CNJC, where the big cases are supposed to go, and we're trying to get the heads of the trafficking rings instead of just poor Habib the farmer who, is just doing what he's got to do to pay the bills. So we have an AUSA, a prosecutor who I believe is from Chicago, or like a really awesome city with like really awesome cases. So now she is here, and you can see up here charges, and then it's written in Dari, guns, and you got a picture of a gun. And then you have the suspects over here, and you can see there's the Muhammad Omar, and he's the getaway driver, Mohammed Ibrahim, and he's always the head of the organization. And then you've got some different guys down here. Big Dowd is my favorite right here. So they run different scenarios, but they have these guys always be in the same fake syndicate, having the same job, so they can figure out what's a drug offense in Dari, how do you have a license, what is intent. So she's working with them to try to get them to figure out how to try these cases, and they've got a massively high conviction rate, which might be a problem also. But anyway, that's it. Cases are being tried there. Does anyone have any questions? Please.
I'm guessing that with 43% of the thank you. I'm guessing with 43% of the people being farmers, and with such drug trafficking and cultivation problems, what kind of scenarios are they running to replace that as an economic basis for them and move them into other occupations, other incentives to deal with that?
That is a great question, and there's a whole team in my office who deals with that. There have been many things tried between the State Department and USAID and all of the other implementers. Sometimes substitution has been suggested, like, why don't you guys grow wheat instead of heroin or poppy? The other thing that's come along with all of this drug use is that we have a lot more users and addicts in Afghanistan than we had 30 years ago. So coupled with that problem of what do you do when the Taliban says you're going to grow me poppy or I'm going to shoot you, is what do you do with all these people who are addicts, massive addicts now? If the women are trying to work in the field, they'll blow opium smoke in the baby's face so the baby will sleep. They're using it as babysitters. There's no good answer for this, really. They're trying all kinds of different things, orchards. It's going to take a long time to build up a whole new agronomy and a disincentive to grow poppy when they make so much money doing it. So, good question. I don't know the answer. Anyone else? Please, sir.
How closely is the State Department working with the Afghanistan National Army? Is there any coordination going on there? Because it would seem that they're kind of shifting into retreat already.
The Afghans?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so, the diplomats coordinating at all to try to soften that retreat to create any stability in those regions that the ANA is pulling out of?
That's a great question. Right now, we're dealing with our DoD partners to deal with the military, so it's a military-to-military intervention. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens once DoD leaves. How does the State Department fill that space? I know that any Afghan I've talked to is very excited for the military to not leave. They do not want us to go. They want us to stay. It took the United States government being in South Korea, we're on 50, 60 years now. And so the Afghans are understandably frustrated with the impatience of the U.S. taxpayer to be like, we're done, we're sick of this war, we're out of here, when it's only been 10 years. So I don't have a good answer to that, but it is certainly something that's being addressed. That's just way outside of my lane, and I honestly don't know. But it's a good question. Ma'am?
When the United States comes in and offers these legal education services and these training and whatnot, does the United States pull from other judicial models in other countries,
Yes.
or do we mainly send our USAs, which, you know, heavily trained in federal law?
That's a great question. It's mainly Americans who go, so it's mainly Americans who know the common law system who go, but we do hire people from all over. Mainly English-speaking countries, though, it is the common law system. However, we just developed a very thick, very juicy manual that's like things you need to know as a prosecutor who knows how to prosecute stuff in the common law. How do you work, one, in a civil law country, and two, how do you work in a Sharia country? Here's how things really work on the ground in Afghanistan. So yeah, it is interesting for somebody from Iowa to be like, wait a second, what's happening? Most people are really savvy and figure out, we're not trying to recreate Iowa and Afghanistan, we're trying to do things the Afghans want. But that is something that we've identified that people need help to figure out how to do this because there's a gap in knowledge and a gap in practice.
Thanks so much. And forgive me if you addressed this earlier. I was stuck in the snow. Can you talk about different rule of law careers? If you're trained as an attorney, these are your options. If you're not, you're trained as a social scientist, these are your options as a foreign service officer. This is how far you can go in rule of law, but if you are a legal specialist, you could go farther. Because I have attended many of these, and the people I ask really don't know. They say, well, there are a few agencies, but they just dabble in it. The World Bank does a tiny bit. Some not-for-profits do a little bit. Just go volunteer for the American Bar Association, get your feet wet, and then find a job. But it's hard to find rule of law jobs.
We can talk more specifically after this, but I would encourage you to get on to a U.S. Institute of International Peace. It's a quasi-U.S. Government organization. They have a website that I can't remember what the acronym stands for. It's called INPROL, but it's rule of law practitioners all talking to each other from all over the world about, hey, we have this problem in East Africa, what do you guys think we should do about it? But it's a great way to network and a great way to find jobs. But if you want to come talk to me afterwards, we can talk specifically. Sir?
Are we working on improving the vetting process for AMP and ANA? Because, there's a frightening amount of coalition casualties from ANP personnel. Are we doing anything about that?
I hope so. The short answer is I don't know, because for whatever reason, the military was assigned police in Afghanistan. Usually that's an INL thing, so we're not involved in the police program. The other problem we have as U.S. government, there's a Leahy law, you guys have heard of this, that if someone receives U.S. government funding, you have to vet them to make sure there aren't any human rights violations. There are no records in Afghanistan to vet these guys, and everybody's named Mohammed. So how do you prove that this Mohammed wasn't that Mohammed? It's just so difficult. So I don't know. That's a great question, though. Anything else? Okay. Thank you very much.